Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill advised discussions of visual media on a non visual podcast, and so much more. Although, actually, not. It's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on. And I know what this means now. Through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns as we start a new book. That's right, we are 4 down and only 11 more to go as we begin book 5 of The Wheel of Time, The Fires of Heaven. I just said a bunch of things that probably made Greg deeply afraid for what the next 5 years of his life are going to look like. Greg, how are you feeling almost a third of the way through this series?
There's just it's so much and it's great. And I was laughing because we've reached the part where it's hard to find the books just sitting on the shelf, right?
Yep.
A lot of kind of standard bookstores stock 1 and 2, and you've pointed out before that they stock the Brandon Sanderson ones from the end of the saga. And I'm having the exact same problem with the Expanse series, which I've been
Mhm.
reading. And there's this dead zone in the middle where people stock the new ones and they stock the first couple. But these are enough of my book buying woes. We're here today to talk about the prologue to The Fires of Heaven, which I really just wanted to get to say myself as well. And that prologue is called The First Sparks Fall.
It's a good one, as far as I'm concerned. We are beginning a tradition today that will live on through the rest of the 11 books that we are going to be reading. This, I think, is our first great example of something Robert Jordan does frequently, the big villain chapter, including a bunch of Forsaken getting in a room for seemingly no reason. We're going to have a lot of these, but this is your first experience with it, Greg. How did you feel about this prologue, which I think could feel like catching up, but also feels like we're seeing a bunch of characters we haven't really encountered before? So it felt kind of new and exciting for me, even as it was recap.
Yes, I think you summed up my feelings about it just there because it did feel like I've referenced this before. Marvel editors have this idea that every issue of a Marvel comic has to be written as if it's somebody's first issue, which is
Yeah.
kind of crazy when it comes down to it. But the idea that you could pick up any one of these books and kind of dive in, this prologue helps with that, or it at least lays it out so that if you were reading these as it came out, I assume it had been like a year since
Yeah.
the last one came out, and so it needed that kind of quick refresher and to move you forward. And actually, because I am reading another series of books, I've been having that debate with myself because oftentimes you want to take a break when you finish one in a series. Obviously our format doesn't allow for this, and I was telling my wife while we were on vacation, like, well, I kind of want to grab the next book while everything's still fresh in my head, but you also kind of need a break. So finding
Yeah.
that balance of like, let me take one book off, or read a couple quick, very different things, and then get back into it. Because there have been series or sequel books where I pick up and I'm like, oh, I waited way too long for
Yeah.
this. So I think there's an art to it. That's what all that rambling is meant to say, and I think this book did it pretty well. And both, as you said, it made you kind of refresh your memory on where we stood, but gave you enough kind of dangling threads for moving forward that it sounded exciting, and it was great to be in a new character's head and things like that.
Definitely. And I think it's time for us to dive in. I don't want to spend too much time talking about this chapter, but before we get into what will probably be an overly long summary from me, I actually want to start with the quote at the beginning of this book, which some of you might have missed if you quickly flipped your way to the beginning of the prologue. In my edition, it is in between the index and the map. which makes it a few pages before the beginning of the prologue. With his coming are the dread fires born again. The hills burn and the land turns sere. The tides of men run out and the hours dwindle. The wall is pierced and the veil of parting raised. Storms rumble beyond the horizon and the fires of heaven purge the earth. There is no salvation without destruction, no hope this side of death, which is a fragment from the prophecies of the dragon, translated 400 AB, which would put it about 2,500 years before the events of the book that we are currently reading. And the reason I wanted to highlight this, first off, it's fun to read prophecy, but second, this is just straight up darker than any prophecy we have gotten so far, right? Other than vague references to the fact that Rand might die, prophecy has largely been, here is your salvation coming. It might not be quite what you want, but things are going to get better. This feels like doom and gloom and death and horror. This is some Book of Revelations prophecy, not some Jesus is coming prophecy. What do you take out of this being the message at the beginning of book 5?
I think that combines the numbering you just walked us through. We're entering Act 2, right? The Empire Strikes Back of this saga, which naturally, in film structure is darker, right? That this is where your characters have now been established and their lives kind of laid out clearly. And this is where you get your characters, ideally, in as much trouble as possible. And so then the third act can hopefully become their rise and their return to grace and their eventual triumph. So I do think it makes me nervous because I like a lot of our characters and I don't want to lose them or see them suffer. But at the same time, it makes me excited as just somebody who likes reading and knows how these things work because I want to get into it. I want to see the drama, right?
Yeah.
I am a messy bitch and I'm here for the drama.
Oh man, you missed your opportunity to good place that and make it messy bench, which I think is just a better joke. But I'm not going to tell you all of the ways that you could replace your swears with random words. Instead, I think it makes sense to dive into our summary of the first sparks fall. And I have not discussed this with Greg at all, but I am going to divide this chapter into 2 parts where we can talk about the White Tower section first and then the Camelin section after. So we begin in Elaida's POV with her wearing the Amerlin stole. She seems angry at all of the women who are around her, who represent all of the Ajas except for the blue Aja, and all of them are wearing their formal stoles. Elaida is largely ignoring them, thinking that they are ignoring the most important thing while discussing matters that don't really mean anything. There is news from Shinar of internal conflict, and Elvierin, who is a white and a keeper against the tradition of the keeper and the Amerlin being from the same Aja, seems to be taking control of the meeting. There is discussion about the Marshal General of Saldia leading an army south because the Blight is quiet, and they assume that Tenobia or Davram Bashir are coming for Mazrim Taim, who has broken free from the Reds. A sister is being sent to Tenobia to counteract Bashir's influence, and the Reds reluctantly admit that they have agents in Shinar, and we learn that each of the Ajas other than the White has a network of agents around the world, although the Yellow's network of agents is also considered to be fairly weak because they don't have much to learn about healing from the typical person. Elvierin checks for agreement with all of the sisters and then names someone to go and talk to Tenobia, and moves on to the troubles in Eridaman and Terabon, where there is concern that the White Cloaks will be able to take over and establish an enormous area that they have control over. There is also a rumor that the Panarch has disappeared and that an Aes Sedai was involved in that disappearance. Elaida seems furious about the fact that she is not being consulted in this discussion at all, and she begins thinking about the grandeur of the room that they're in and how the Merlin study is the center of the room. She also thinks about how she has put her own stamp on the room, including 2 paintings that everyone except for Elvierin is pointedly ignoring in the room. At this point, the Aes Sedai ask after Elaine and Galad, both of whom apparently are missing, and we get an update on Gawain, who apparently is still leading the younglings, and while he is technically allied with the White Tower, he seems to be ignoring orders and skirmishing skirmishing with the White Cloaks without taking any real kind of suggestions from the tower. We also learn that Morghese is intending to put in a claim in Cairhien, and that she is currently so engaged with Gabriel that she really isn't paying attention to anything else. We learn that Pedron Nial is trying to convince Altara and Murundi to give up land rather than be invaded by Ilion, and Elaida thinks that the tower fears what is going on in the world in a way that it never has before. At this point, she looks at the paintings on her wall, one of them of the last Reda Merlin, who was torn down for nearly destroying the tower by defying Arthur Hawkwing, and the other is Rand and Ishamael battling in the clouds above Falm. Elvierin begins to end the meeting when Elaida steps in and tells all of the women to remain standing because they have been ignoring her this entire time. She asks whether that woman, who is apparently Siwan, has been found, and they are told it is difficult because they have aided the rumors that she is dead. Elaida then asks whether or not they have found any of the others who left the White Tower, noting that none of the Blue Aja are in the tower at all, and is also told that there is no real sign of that group. Finally, she begins talking about Terran soldiers in Cairhien, which brings the topic of conversation to Rand, and Elaida then forces them to look at the painting of Rand and admit that they are afraid of his arrival and that they are not doing what they need to. She then dismisses all of the women, sending them away and telling them that they must find information about where Rand is or there will be punishment. Elvierin is the only one who stays, and Elaida thinks that Elvierin is an especially difficult problem because she is mostly responsible for Elaida being there as the first one who was able to secure support for her coup against Suan. At this point, one of the accepted arrives and says that Padden Fane is there and is told to let him in. We then switch to Padden Fane's POV, who is thinking that he can take advantage of the tension in the White Tower and the division elsewhere, and he thinks that Elaida is harder than Siwan, but also more fragile and easy to break. He is delighted to see that Elaida coldly dismisses Elvierin, and then he thinks that that Elvierin knows too much about Padden Fane, and he sees this every once in a while when she looks at him, but then he thinks of himself as both Padden Fane and Mordeth, a name that we could recognize from Shadar Logoth, and he begins thanking the Merlin for the coat he gave her, basically trying to get her on his side, and then begins describing Rand to her, describing him as jealous and vicious and evil in a way that we know is not completely true. There's more of this chapter, but that's where I'm stopping. What was your thought about getting in the head of Elaida, who we've encountered a few times before, but this is kind of our first opportunity to see what the White Tower looks like after the coup, and I'm very interested in that as much as I am about this new character that we've gotten in the head of.
It is a really interesting place to start. And I think I naturally play the game of, okay, why those details, right? Like
Yep.
every little bit that comes up, I'm like, oh, well, I remember that or I didn't remember that, but why did we pick that detail to bring us up? And I have a few that fall into that. But largely speaking, I will admit I was thinking of another television obsession of yours and I's, which is The West Wing. And there's a point somewhere in early West Wing where they admit that they've been so busy with the concerns walking in the door and going day to day that they forgot the kind of grand vision of what they wanted to achieve when they
Yeah.
got in the White House. And I think that's, actually pretty realistic to the experience of a lot of politicians, right? That the job, you lose sight of the big dreams and the big vision. So I liked that feeling here, and it is also the kind of inverse because
Yeah.
it's like because we're in her head, I'm like, oh yes, she should try to achieve what she wants, and then it's like, oh no, wait, no, that's terrible. Like it's
Yeah.
good she's getting bogged down in the details of the day to day. So I liked that kind of transporting of that sentiment into the fantasy realm. I thought that worked pretty nicely. And I will also just throw in here that I loved the comedy of like find her, and they're like, we can't really spread word that we're looking for her because
Yeah.
you said she was dead, and that is kind of dark but really fun.
Yeah, this is something that I think we've experienced in Nynaeve's point of view a few times, where Nynaeve kind of has like a very specific plan and view of herself, and then we see people say things that kind of indicate she's not as in control of the world as she makes herself seem, right? And I think Elaida, we're getting the same thing, but instead of it being played for comedy, it's being played for like, oh, it's a little scary. This woman is in charge of the most powerful institution in the world, right? Elaida in this chapter seems to have like half a grasp on a lot of really important things. And that's just a little bit terrifying as far as I'm concerned. While we discuss all of the things that Elaida is kind of half getting, I think this is a good opportunity for everyone to pull out your maps, because what this chapter did for me more than anything else is made me recognize just how much of the map we have already gotten some kind of pieces on the board in, because when we walk through all of the items discussed, pretty much everything except a little bit in the center of this map is covered. So if you don't mind, Greg, I would love to talk through the news of the world kind of country by country and just keep an eye on the map as we're doing so. Obviously, if you're listening at home and you're like driving, please do not pull up the map. But if you have the opportunity to, this is a good opportunity to add some visual to your non-visual podcast. We are going to begin in the very northeast of the map, where we learn that in Shinar, there has been significant amount of conflict between Shinarans, which is very rare because in the Borderlands, the ability to need to battle the Blight usually reduces the number of civil wars. Now, it is worth noting we have been in Shinar before. At the end of the first book, this is where we went to go to the Eye of the World. At the beginning of the second book, this is where the Merlin went to meet with Rand and Moraine and the others. And so the fact that there's conflict there is odd, because I don't know what that conflict would be about. There were not a lot of seeds of dissent or dissension the last time that we were in that region. Did you have any thoughts about kind of this hint that we were getting early on in the chapter?
Man, I have so many thoughts. Some dumb, some smart. Starting with the dumb ones. In my other podcast life, where I host the Long Take Review, we're living in Twister's land right now, having just rewatched Twister, and so all I could think of in the first Twister movie from the '90s, there's a music clip featuring the song "Shine On." And it's, a sweeping helicopter shot over a hill where the music's just like blaring, going, shine, shine. And so I was just in my head the whole time going, shine our, shine our. So that's the dumb one.
Yep.
The smarter one, I won't promise smart, but smarter. I will say I immediately put in my notes land plot question mark, because we know that land is very important in that part of the world.
Yep.
And particularly that he could raise his banner and everybody would come together. So if there's a problem of a civil war, who cares about why? Land can solve it. But we also have had hints at this land brother,
Yeah.
uncle, brother, somebody who cousin. That's a brother uncle. That's what we in New Hampshire call
I'll
our
give you
cousins. It's a
credit for
brother
that,
uncle.
honestly.
And so it seems to me we had these hints that this troublemaker, whose name I shall not remember, stalker,
Isam.
shiner, speaker, and the one in the Two Rivers may be related to that situation. And so if he just got kind of his whooping in the Two Rivers, maybe he's up there to cause some trouble. Because it does seem like some time has passed. It doesn't seem like hugely significant, because we know Padan Fane was on his way to the White Tower, but he did say he was going to go to Camelin first. So
yeah,
it could be some time.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, in the first book, it was probably a month and a half or so between the time that the kids left, maybe not a month and a half, maybe 3 or 4 weeks between when they left the Two Rivers and when they got to Camelin. So assuming slightly faster travel than that, it's probably at least a month since the last book that we're talking about, if Padan Fane is in Tar Valon. Our next stop on our map tour is to skip over Arafel and Kandor at the top of the map and go all the way over to the northwest side, where we will be looking at Saldia. We are told in Saldia, the Blight is quiet, but that has freed up an army to march south. Apparently, Davram Bashir is leading an army south and may have Queen Tenobia with him, and they are apparently interested in tracking down Mazrim Tayyim, who was the false dragon, who we know originally started a war in Saldia until he was captured by the Reds, but now has been set free by the Black Aja. It is also worth noting the name Bashir should be very familiar to you from Fail Bashir. So this is her father who is leading that army. We haven't been to Saldia, but it's pretty clear that a bunch of things we've read about have rippled here, and Fail's father being on the move is fascinating for me, who is interested in the Perrin plot. What do you take away from this news of the world?
Was that the parent plot or the parent plot? This is like a Meet the Parents type movie that's going to be unfolding.
It can be two things. We can pun on this.
So I will just say, because I was slightly confused when you started talking, Saldia is firmly in the spine of the book. So if you are having trouble finding this, really stretch your spine and you'll find it there. Due north of the two rivers. But yes, I actually was able to piece together that those were Fail's parents or people, and that would be probably part of the book ahead.
Excellent. The next information that we get is to the southwest of Saldia. Erid Doman and Terabon are still apparently being torn apart by civil war. This makes sense. That is a war that was begun when the land between Erid Doman and Terabon were torn apart by the Seanchan with the battle at Falm. So we are still seeing the ripple effects of that. And then as we start to talk about Terabon, we get a couple of pieces of news there. One is that the White Cloaks seem to be establishing more control, and the concern from the White Tower is that they may gain control over the entire southwestern portion of this map. But second, we also learn that news about what is going on in Tanchico has gotten out, and while they hear about the Panarch and a sister, we know that is a Panarch and either Nynaeve or Elaine creating that rumor. I don't have a ton here, but I think it's kind of amazing that we can basically say like Erid Doman is on our list of places that have been affected by Rand and Co., even though they're not nearly in a place that we've actually been throughout this book.
I am just also taking this as a reminder that Tanchico is on that western coast. I think sometimes mentally I put it down closer to Ilion because they moved from Ilion to Tanchico fairly quickly, but that is just a credit to the sailors.
Correct. The next news we get relates to 4 countries that are all kind of packed together in the southern part of the map. So we are talking about Amadicia, Altara, Murindi, and Ilion. So the news is that Hadron Nial, the head of the White Cloaks, who is located in Amador, the capital of Amadicia, he is advising both Altara and Murindi to give up land rather than be invaded by Ilion. And we as readers know the reason why Ilion is being so aggressive is because it is being ruled by Samael. Moraine found that out in the 3rd book when they briefly passed through the area. So this gives us both an update on one of the Forsaken. He is kind of pressuring his neighbors but hasn't yet gone to war. And we're also getting an update on the White Cloaks, who seem to be exerting more and more influence over some of the area, not only west of their control, but also east of it, influencing both Altara and Murindi. This is kind of the messiest piece of news because there's so many moving pieces. Anything you took away from this?
This is largely a blank part of the map, but I will take what you said and find that helpful that the White Cloaks are just kind of on the rise there. And if we extend that back all the way to Tanchico, as your last section pointed out, that's a significant chunk of territory, right?
Yeah.
This is the risk player you haven't been paying attention to, who now is coming out of Singapore and about to spread across Asia in one fell swoop.
I'm mad that that is your metaphor because it's too good. I can't compete with it. I will also point out this does not get any notes in the White Towers discussion, but just north of Amadisia is Galden, which is the area that Loghain once terrorized, and just north of that is the Two Rivers. So a pretty big swath of territory doesn't get discussed, but has definitely been affected by our characters. The next thing in our update of the world is we get news from Andor, where we learn that a few interesting things are going on. One, Morgaze is interested in putting in a claim in Kyrien, which we know has been experiencing civil war since Tom killed their king. And second, we learn that Morgaze's family is scattered and we don't entirely know where all of them are. Galad apparently has gone missing since the coup at the tower. Elaine, obviously, the White Tower doesn't know where she is, although we do. And Gawain, it turns out, is still in the area, but is no longer fully following the orders of the White Tower and is clashing with the White Cloaks, which I find to be a much more troubling place for that character to be than kind of the place of safety I think we assumed he would have after the coup. What are your thoughts here, which I think is maybe the place that has the most plot threads that feel immediate rather than reminders?
It feels like that's been a pot kind of simmering on the back burner for a long time. We got reminders all through book 4 about that and those relationships.
Yeah.
Galad and Gawain, as we've joked about, like, stop trying to make us care about them, but it feels like this is not a reminder so that you can pick this up in book 6. It does feel immediate, as you just said, and we'll continue here. Um, let's see if we care about any of those people. I don't not care about Morgaze, but I still don't care about the boys, so we'll see.
Yeah, it's a little hard to care too much about the boys. I completely understand that. Uh, we then get Elaida yelling at a bunch of Aes Sedai for not taking Rand seriously and also not being able to do things that are more or less impossible. I'm torn in this section between it's clear that Elaida doesn't have a plan but knows what the important pieces are, and also this idea that Elaida is mismanaging this group, right? She is taking this very aggressive, very domineering, like, I will break you down so you will respect me. And just based on the reaction of the women in the room, Elaida feels like she's won, and I feel like she has isolated all of her important allies. What was your take on kind of the Elaida White Tower politics section of this chapter?
It feels very much like somebody out of control. And you said it earlier, when you have somebody who feels incompetent in charge of so much,
Yeah.
that feels scary. And so this feels scary. That makes me feel, kind of, just to take a swing at it, that this is not going to be a long rule of Tar Valon, that these will either the tower will fall or she will fall, and consequences will ensue from there. But as you're implying, this is somebody not in control of her people, not in control of your allies. I feel like if we were from a country with a parliament, we would
Yeah.
understand this a lot better, right? But from what my limited understanding of, like, kind of half watching French election news, is it's kind of what a parliament situation is, which is you need a
Yep.
coalition of similar parties, as opposed to it here in America where we have two. And if you break your coalition, eventually you're just ruling this very small group that can't succeed, and the everybody else will fill the void within it.
Yeah, and I think the most interesting piece of this is that we're already seeing that void partially filled in the White Tower, right? It seems like Elaida is struggling to fully hold on to her rule, and Alviarin is stepping into that power vacuum, right? She's essentially running this meeting. She's making decisions without consulting with Elaida. And so while we've really focused on Elaida as the cause of the coup, I think it's really important to start thinking about Alviarin as someone who is at least trying to keep Elaida as kind of the puppet and her as the real power behind the throne. So watching the dynamics of those two, I'm very interested in going forward, especially because Elaida kind of admits how much power Elviarin has over her, given that Elviarin essentially gave her the Emerald seat.
Not a lot to add to that, but I mean, if we're talking broad strokes, the prologue's supposed to make you excited for the book, I just want to keep reading. I want to see this happen, this evolve, these plots come together.
Then we get confirmation of a few different things that we've been vaguely talking about that we can finally have a real discussion about. Number one, Elaida very explicitly mentions the fact that there is now a red sister in Camelin who was chosen to serve in Camelin because she is young enough that she does not yet have the Aes Sedai face, which makes a woman look ageless once she has worked with the power for long enough. Finally, we can explain why Aes Sedai look younger than they should. This has been a weird, not really mystery, but at least I have an answer for you, even if it's not complete. Did you pick up on that? Was it exciting to you? It's a little detail, but it's one that we've kind of been hovering around for a while.
Didn't really care as much as you are making me feel bad about not caring because I do think this is a case where I kind of have just accepted it, particularly because of the TV show
Yeah.
Cross-Eyed Between Universes version of this. But I would love to hear your explanation.
Oh, I don't have an explanation. It's just, hey, look, there's the thing. We'll get a good explanation of it in like 7 books. I just need to keep reminding you when we get little details. Yeah. It's the wheel of time. You gotta wait some time for the wheel to turn. The other interesting detail that I got here comes not in Elaida's POV, but early in Padden Fane's POV, when he reveals that he thinks of himself as Padden Fane, but also thinks of himself as Mordeth, which is a name that we haven't heard in 3 or 4 books. You'll recall when Mat was in Shadar Logoth and originally found the dagger that poisoned him, he met a person there who claimed to be Mordeth, who Moraine claimed was basically a manifestation of the evil of Shadar Logoth, and that if Mat had touched him or taken anything, it could basically possess him, or, you know, it was what caused that problem that Mat was dealing with until he was healed by the Aes Sedai. It's worth noting Padden Fane had the same dagger as Mat for about the same amount of time that Mat did, and his change seems to be a little bit more permanent because the Aes Sedai didn't heal him. This immediately, to me, screams it makes me think like Gollum in The Lord of the Rings, right? A character who at one point was very much twisted and a servant of evil, but now is influenced by another force and almost seems to be 2 types of evil at once. I'm very curious to see where this goes. Did you have thoughts on Padden Fane and this kind of revelation about his identity?
We definitely think about Gollum differently, but that we'll save that for Through the Shire, dear folks, or whatever that show is called. No, I think what stood out to me most is he's saying within that spread, like, I feel the dagger, it's here. And I was like, well, we kind of set the dagger aside for a long time, so it felt like it mattered. He does mention the horn as well, but it felt more important to me that the dagger from a plot line we kind of felt like was over is getting kind of reintroduced here as nope, not over yet. So that's kind of what my main takeaway was from that section.
Yeah, no, and I think that makes sense. The only last note I had in this section of the chapter is Padden Fane is creating some real issues for Rand going forward, right? If Elaida is to be the Merlin for any extended period of time, we expect Rand to have to interact with that, and Padden Fane is poisoning the well for any interaction that Rand will ever have with Elaida, painting him as super maniacal and willing to manipulate makes it really hard for someone who seems to be pretty direct and honest like Rand to get anywhere by being direct and honest.
Yeah, and it's hard to tell if Padden Fane is just so good he's really like understands all of that, or if he's just kind of a chaos agent, right? And it feels more to me like a chaos agent than, as opposed, we always joke about Moraine playing 3-dimensional chess. I don't think Padden Fane is that guy, you know. And we've talked before about like Heath Ledger's Joker as like a just pure agent of chaos, and it feels a little more like that, though more sinister, right? I guess not chaotic neutral, but chaotic bad.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about the kind of forces within Haddon Fane, I feel like where I'm at is that Haddon Fane is very much Heath Ledger's Joker. But the force that we are dealing with now seems to be Haddon Fane plus Mordeth, and Mordeth is a much more kind of traditional, like, kill everyone evil kind of thing. So it feels like it was a chaotic neutral character and a neutral evil character smashed together into what now feels very chaotic evil.
Exciting. Again,
Yeah.
I'm just going to come back to, again, if you want me to care more about Paddon Fane than I have in a couple books, that seems like a pretty good way to do so.
Any last thoughts on this entire section of the chapter before we talk about what will soon become a near and dear tradition to our hearts, the Forsaken chapter?
I will just say this feels very much like in 6 months, you're going to ask me, who were the POV characters? And I will definitely forget Elaida because we won't be here in her head again. So that's my prediction. This was a kind of
Valid.
treat, a little morsel, and we'll go far away from her head moving forward.
Well, Elaida's going to be hard to remember, but Paddon Fane and Ravin might be harder. Ravin's POV. We begin with Ravin handling flows of spirit on a couple of servants, a man and a woman. He is using compulsion. Some people's sense of self, we learn, is so strong that they can resist compulsion. He thinks that he is using one that keeps trying to escape, but he needs her, and so he continues to use her. He tells the woman in front of him to get to her feet, and he removes some of the compulsion from her so that it can't be detected, but tells her to forget everything that she has seen when she leaves the building and think that she has just been on her normal walk. At this point, a woman speaks behind Ravin, and he turns, holding Sidene, to see Lanfear. He prepares traps and attacks and tells her that she needs to send emissaries rather than coming directly. She says that the woman who was just sent away is Aes Sedai, and we learn that it is the Red Aja who was sent to look after Morgaze that was discussed in the previous section of the chapter. Lanfear then says that other Forsaken are coming, and he says that she was never one to strike outright, and so he agrees to trust her, at least for the moment. Samael arrives, as well as Grendel, who has a number of compulsion servants in tow. Nearly half of the surviving Forsaken are in one place, as we learn, and we can talk about where all of the Forsaken are later on. And we also learn that Grendel basically has the ability to control the people who she has compulsion on so strongly that, according to Ravin, it ruins them and they are no longer useful tools going forward. Ravin thinks that this is wasteful. We learn that Demandred is too arrogant to meet with the rest of the group, and that everyone knows that Asmodean has turned onto Rand's side, and so that is why he is not here. When asked why Lanfear didn't kill Rand and Asmodean, she says that death is too final, and both of them may still be useful to her plan. We then get a discussion about whether or not Rand is Lews Therin himself or Lews Therin reborn and how powerful he is. And we get the discussion that Lews Therin was apparently the strongest who ever lived, that Samael got a scar from Lews Therin that he refuses to remove until he defeats Lews, and finally that Lanfear seems to be convinced that Rand is not Lews Therin, but does have the potential with the power that Lews Therin once did, despite the fact that he is just a shepherd. Samael seems confident, and he says that Rand has no 100 companions, and so he will never be as successful as he was in the past age. But Lanfear then begins taunting to him with what would happen if Rand attacked them directly, and Ravin has to restrain Samael from inflaming the conflict between Grendel and Lanfear, as Lanfear is kind of picking at Grendel. And eventually, Lanfear reveals that she has a plan for all of them to work together and not strike against one another. And when asked why only the 4 of them are involved in this plan, she says, "Why do we need more? And many of the other Forsaken may be killed by Rand while they are executing their plan." She says that someone is trying to manipulate Rand, although she is not sure whether it is Moghedien or Demandred, and then Lanfear lays out a plan to the group, who seems quite interested and willing to go along with it, although we don't get the details. That's a lot of things to say about a chapter where we don't get any concrete information about anything other than what the Forsaken look like. Was this interesting to you, or was this a moment where you were like, just get on with it, I want the real plot?
Somewhere in between, probably. Definitely wanted to spend more time there. It does feel, part of when we've talked about prophecy, I'd say, well, I just hate when they're like these teases and the author knows exactly who they are and they're just kind of playing with us. Oh, who knows when we're recording, but there was a very good joke in the new trailer for the Deadpool Wolverine movie where Deadpool says, "So are you going to tell me what's bothering you, or are we waiting for a third act flashback?" And I do feel like that plays out in a moment like this, right? It's that same
Yeah.
kind of thing where like you could just tell us everything and we could know, or you could tease us and move forward. So
Yeah.
I think I understand it, but feel a little bit of natural frustration around that. Um, Outside of that, I was excited to meet a couple more new Forsaken. I think we've continued to hit this drum of the Forsaken are not a unified group, but they are politicking and jockeying against each other
Yeah.
as a kind of team of rivals, all trying to be the top to be with the Dark One.
Yeah.
And so I think that was interesting and exciting that Lanfear seems to be bringing together this coalition.
Yeah.
I liked the entry of Grendel and Raven. Grendel, of course, reminiscent of the monstrous creature in Beowulf, kind of a whole different piece of literature, not an angel that we haven't
Yeah.
brought in before. But the idea again that maybe all our mythology kind of comes together in the group of the Forsakens is exciting and interesting.
Yeah.
And I think my last thought, because this has been long and rambly, is just that I spent a lot of this trying to reconcile Lanfear here with Lanfear at the end of the last book,
Yeah.
where she was definitely playing up that she was leaving Asmodean to help Rand. And I think my head is naturally saying, well, which is the truth? And I think it's that both are the truth. I think Lanfear is a character who plays every possible move she can so that she always comes out on top.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And given that this is a chapter that is not, or this section of the chapter is not doing a lot for the plot, it's mostly kind of catching us up with these characters. I kind of want to structure our discussion here as Forsaken Watch, right? Like, I want to just run through all 13. What do we know about them? Where are they at? Let's start with the ones that aren't in this chapter, and then we'll eventually get to the really important ones that we've talked about for a while. Does that seem reasonable? Is there anything you want
Sounds
to talk
great.
about before we do that? Awesome. Okay. There are 13 Forsaken at the beginning of this series. At this point, 4 of them have died. So 2 of them died at the beginning or in the first book. So that was Agenor and Balthamel were both at the Eye of the World. One was killed by Moraine, one was killed by Rand. Our second set of dead Forsaken happened at the Stone of Tyr, where we all remember Ishamael was killed by Rand in their duel, but it's worth noting shortly before that, Belal was killed by Moraine using Balefire. So of the original 13, 4 are dead in 2 different encounters.
And it was Ishamel was presenting as the Dark One. So
Correct.
if people's memories are confused, the Dark One, quote unquote, seemingly died, but that was Ishamel pretending to be the Dark One.
Accurate. We then have 5 Forsaken who we have at least some bits of information about, but are not in this scene. So the first of those is the one that we know the most about. Asmodean, we know, is currently prisoner with Rand after Lanfear left him to be Rand's teacher. We don't get a whole lot about him. I don't know if there's need for any comment, but that is a Forsaken whose location we know. We also get hints, or we've had hints in the previous book about Moghedien. We know that she is currently in Tanchico, that she was looking for the sad bracelets and the seal to the Dark One's prison, and that she was briefly captured by Nynaeve before escaping in the previous book. We get some hints here about a Forsaken named Demandred, who is apparently too arrogant to show up for this meeting. There are 2 others who are not mentioned at all in this chapter. One of them, Semiraj, is a female Forsaken, and the other one, I honestly can't remember which of the 13 we haven't talked about yet, but there's a 5th one that hasn't been mentioned thus far. I don't think we have too much to talk about with these because they're not in the chapter, but it's good to just kind of keep up on which ones do we know locations, which one do we not know anything about. Those are 5 living Forsaken who are not here. We then have the four Forsaken in this scene, which I think each of them, let's give a quick overview and talk about what we learned about them and what's new here. So the character who I think we know the least about is Grendel. We learn that she uses compulsion to control her servants. We learn, according to Lanfear, that she is someone who typically prefers to attack with armies as opposed to being in the shadows like Moghedien and Lanfear. And we learn that, according to Lanfear, she is establishing a base of power somewhere in the world in the same way that Samael has taken Ilion and Ravin has taken Caemlyn. But crucially, we do not know which kingdom or kingdoms Grendel currently has some sort of political power in. So that's going to be a mystery that we'll want to be thinking about. Where could she potentially be posing as a ruler or someone advising the ruler? What are your thoughts on Grendel, our brand new Forsaken in this chapter?
Again, I love Beowulf, so I'm really excited that this name has been
Yeah.
recycled. And we both live in Boston, and one of the absolute best restaurants in Harvard Square is called Grendel's Den. So that just makes me excited because I've always had a soft spot for Grendel. Now we're gonna fight about
I've never
restaurants in
been there.
Harvard
I need
Square.
to try it.
Wait, I thought we went there together.
If we did, I don't remember the name.
Wow, that's harsh. I think we went there together after a funeral we attended in Harvard
Oh,
Square.
that place. Yeah, that place was really good.
But so I think it was very helpful to hear you just say that we should be thinking about where they are established within this continent. I think we just took a big spin around the map, but there's a lot of names on that map we didn't touch. And
Yeah.
is established controlling a region, or is it controlling a city? Yet to see. So that's exciting.
Absolutely. 3 left to go. The next one, who I think we have the least information about, is Samael. We had a brief encounter with him, not directly, but Moraine had seen him in the 3rd book when they were passing through the city of Ilion, and they fled, and Samael was the one who sent the Darkhounds after them. We learn here that he is apparently very vain, that he was once defeated by Lews Therin and received a scar and refuses to have it removed until he defeats Lews Therin, and that kind of rivalry seems really defining in the way that Lanfear thinks about him. There's a lot of new kind of small character details here, but I think it's a really interesting portrait. I feel like Samael actually gets the spotlight in terms of a character moment more than anyone else in this chapter. What did you think about his introduction?
I do like having just like one clear detail to really establish them. It's kind of my son is forever playing the Pokemon Go app, and it's like, yeah, the flyy guy, or the one
Yeah.
that looks like a pig, or whatever. And it's kind of that system here for Forsaken. I then think about how like these all just feel like deep teases because I'm still thinking Rand's not coming back to this side of the
Right.
world for this book. So while I appreciate that there's going to be kind of at some point a showdown between Rand or between Luz and this character Samael, I'm not expecting it anytime soon.
Totally. Ravin is our next Forsaken. He is the POV character here. We learn that he is skilled at compulsion. He is the one who is currently more or less ruling in Caemlyn. We learned in the 3rd book that he has so much influence over Morgase that she is essentially doing everything he wants. And at the early part of this chapter, I think we get some hints that Morgase is resisting that compulsion, but Ravin feels like he still needs her. This is a really interesting one because I don't think Ravin is really the focus of this chapter, right? Lanfear is the one who really pushes things forward. What was your take on this character who we get a POV, but not really a whole lot of insight into him?
Yeah, it definitely felt like a frame device
Yeah.
more than anything. When and this chapter has the feel of there's an opening. Gosh, I want to say it's the 5th or maybe it's the 6th Harry Potter. It might be the 6th. They open with a Death Eaters kind of meeting like this in a
Oh,
lot of
yeah.
ways, and there's a Hogwarts teacher being tortured by the snake, I think, in the middle of the table, and so it's kind of like told from that point of view, or very
Yeah.
much about that person witnessing this, but they get killed off at the part of it. So it does just feel like that kind of frame, like Ravin is here.
Yeah.
Makes me think of Raven, which, Ravens have been a part of this. Makes me think of Star Wars Darth Revan. So it kind of is just, to me, an effective mythological bad guy name, but not much deeper than that.
Anytime something terrible happens in Camelin, I now just need to say the phrase, "That's so Robin," but I think I'm okay with no other jokes being made here. Our last Forsaken, then, 13 of 13, is Lanfear. And I think you were exactly right to point out the dilemma that we are faced with as readers here, which is that we have had 4 straight books of Lanfear telling Rand, hey, I'm kind of on your side. I love you. You should become evil. And now we're getting Lanfear trying to convince 3 other evil characters that Rand is in fact so good they need to band together and kill him. I think it's our first real sign that we don't quite know who Lanfear is, because anything she puts on could be a facade, right? It's easy when you're only seeing one side of the coin to think it's not going to change, but once you've seen both sides, you know just kind of how slippery Lanfear's persona is.
And so I'll just add delicious, right? Like that is what a good villain should be. I want to be guessing. I don't like all the answers. The Star Wars fandom has been having this fight lately. I just listened to some commentators I usually respect being like, well, they should have stopped in the middle of that lightsaber duel and explained that cool material and what its powers were and how
Oh,
it. And I was like,
jeez.
no, nobody wants anything like
Yeah.
that. Like this is what you want. You want ambiguity. You want mystery. You want kind of a slow unfurling of details. And so,
Yeah.
I think Lanfear had left my radar. I wasn't that impressed. And we keep referring obliquely to our friends with crushes on TV show actors, but our friends were very impressed with Lanfear on the television show. And so I'm excited to see more of her and maybe get on the bandwagon.
Yeah, I think she's a really fascinating character who we really haven't seen a ton of, and we've mostly been getting it from Rand's POV. And let's be real, Rand is oblivious to a lot of stuff a lot of the time. What was your thought overall on Forsaken chapter, right? This is a thing where we get a lot of vague hints and a lot of interesting details about villains and nothing else. Did it justify the 12 pages for you?
I think you said this is a new experience, and it is, and it's exciting. We'll keep getting these, but it does feel like what the language of the prologues has been across these books, I
Mm.
guess, with the exception of that opening one that had the Muppet Baby section that,
Yeah.
was added later. But it's just meant to be like, oh, there's a bigger world going on, and things are spinning and working their way towards fruition, and we'll get there eventually. And so I think it's largely effective. And I would jump back to just the title, right, is kind of fun. The first sparks fall, because that brings imagery of a conflagration, to
Yeah.
come. And the chapter we're about to say seems to suggest that comes to be. So it's largely effective. And I'm excited, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it was a long trip to this book, and I'm excited to start it out.
Oh man, it's not even that long of a trip to this book. We're so far from the end of this series, and I'm so excited for all of you to get even more Wheel of Time in your life. Next week, we are only going to be covering one chapter. It is a real thick boy that is like 3 or 4 C's on that thick. Chapter 1 is Fanning the Sparks, and y'all, we get to read about wheels turning and winds blowing. I love that every time we start a new book. What are you excited for in book 5? And then say the name of your podcast and we can go to sleep because it's already like 8:30.
There's an old man. Yeah, and it's very exciting to start a new book. It's funny as we push towards the end of a book, I find myself like frantic to be like, Tyler, let's record again. Let's record again. I want to keep reading. And so then when we start another one, it's like a breath of fresh air. It's like, again, we don't always admit these things, but we took a little time off and we kind of had our summer vacations. And it's like, let's get back into this world. So I'm excited to start it off and begin. That is a long chapter. I think it was close to 40 in mine. So be aware, readers, as you're pacing yourselves. And as we record this, I was expecting with all these nice Lord of the Rings trailers to get a little update about Wheel of Time TV show, but I don't think we've heard anything out of San Diego Comic-Con as of this recording. So we hope that across our Fridays in August, you are enjoying our episodes about season 2 of the television show. Those will be coming out on Fridays, kind of alternating with before this episode and now with this episode. So don't get those confused. If we ever hear what the plans are, we will try to make sure we continue commenting on the television show. You already threw it to me, so you don't get to comment, but I will tell from your nodding. I assume your assumption is the same as mine, which is they just don't want to get their fantasy shows confused. So they'll kind of put the kind of information out there about Rings of Power and let Rings of Power wrap up. I mean, there's already such a crowded fantasy marketplace with House of the Dragon going on too that it feels like let's clear all this out and maybe we'll get a treat to either a late fall or spring season of Wheel of Time. Hey, that was a lot of rambling. Why don't I just go through the glass columns?
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.